title of this year is the first half of Maggid really necessary? Mark already called me out on that last week, saying that there are other, maybe even more problematic sections of the Haggadah, which feel like are less important,
even
like Nirtza, for example. All the songs there. What's with all those songs? But nevertheless, for tonight, for next little bit, we'll just focus on the first half of Maggid and try to look at different elements and see, take one or two approaches, see what it's all about. The question, I guess, that I'm asking, to borrow a term from Rav Soloveitchik, is I'm coming, I guess, from the halachic man perspective, meaning that what are we trying to do in Maggid? In the Maggid section of the Haggadah, we are, I could say, that's where we are really fulfilling the mitzvah that we have on the Seder night of Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim, of telling over the story of Yetzias Mitzrayim. And if that is really the goal of Maggid, if that is what we are doing in Maggid, then we could take a look maybe at the first half of Maggid and see, are we really doing that in the first half of Maggid? Meaning, I think we generally focus where we end up telling a lot of the story of Yetzias Mitzrayim is really in the second half of Maggid through the psukim of Arami Ovei Rabbi. We bring the 4 psukim from Sefer Devarim that one recites as when they bring the new fruits to the Beis HaMikdash, and we take those verses and we extrapolate those and we expand really upon those verses to help us tell the story of Yetzias Mitzrayim. So what is really with the first half? So first, what I want to do on the source sheet is look at the Rambam. The Rambam, I think, has probably the most detailed explanation of how you'll fulfill the mitzvah of Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim, and then after that we'll take a look maybe at some of the sections of Maggid and see what's how do they square with each other. I have the English and the Hebrew. I'm going to read in the Hebrew. You can follow along in English if you like. So source number. So I'm quoting from the Rambam in the Mishnah Torah, in the 7th parak of Hilchos Chametz U'Matzah and Halacha. And what I want to focus on is what is the Rambam, what is necessary from the Rambam, what elements are required in the content of what we are trying to say in the fulfillment of Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim. What elements do we need to fulfill again in the content that we're going to say? So he begins, Mitzvahs Aseh Shel Torah l'saper b'nisim b'niflaos shenasu lavoseinu b'Mitzrayim. There is a positive commandment from the Torah to tell about the miracles and the wonders that occurred to our forefathers in Egypt. Belel Chamishasar b'Nisan, on the 15th of Nisan, Shneimar, quotes a pasuk from Shmos, Zachor es hayom hazeh asher yitzasem miMitzrayim, that you shall remember the day that you left Egypt. K'ma Shneimar, he compares it here. We don't have time to get into why he makes the comparison, but to Zachor es Yom HaShabbos, he compares it to the Zechira that we have on Shabbos. So that's an interesting point. And then what he concludes, Halacha Aleph, Uminai Shabbalel Chamishasar, how do we know it's on the 15th? Talmud Lomar Vigat Alvincha B'Yamahu Lemor, it says on this day, Bavur Zeh, B'Shah Shish Matzah Mar Munachem Fanecha. So you have to fulfill this mitzvah at a time when you're eating the matzah, eating the maror as well. Afal Pishein Loben, Apilu Chachamim Gedolim, even if you don't have a son, even if you're big Talmid Chacham, Chayavim L'Saper B'Tzias Mitzrayim, V'chol Marich B'Dvarim She'iru, V'Shahayu Arizim Meshubach. And the more you say, the better it is, more praiseworthy it is. So, I think in Halacha Aleph, all that he's saying in terms of the content, what is the mitzvah that we have to say in terms of content? We have to discuss the miracles that really took place to our forefathers in Egypt. So that's one element. Let's move on to Halacha Beis. Mitzvah lo dia lebanim. You have a commandment to tell your son, even if they don't ask. Shenemar, as it says,
children or son.
Children. Shenemar vigata levincha. It says here son. I think we can assume children. Lefi da'ato shel ben abi melamdo. However, whatever the capacity of the son is, the father teaches him. And then he goes on to explain ketzad imayakata no tipesh, if he was a young one or if he was a foolish one. So Omer Lo, we just says simply, B'ni kulanu hayinu avadim k'mo shivcha zo o k'mo eved zeh b'Mitzrayim u'v'layla zeh pada osanu hakadosh baruch hu b'yotenu l'cheirus. So he says, I guess the simplest way to fulfill the mitzvah is to just tell your child, how do you leave, we were slaves and we were free. If he's smarter, he may have been gadol v'chacham, and if he's even smarter, modia mashir lanim b'mitzrayim, then he goes into more detail, etc., etc. So he doesn't really add on, I don't think, so much in there. In halacha gimel in the beginning, b'tzarich laso shinoi b'lay lazeh, you have to make shinuyim, you have to change, you have to change it up almost during the seder. Why? Kadesh yiru habanim yishalu, because you want the children to go ahead and ask. That's another element. So I think so far, from my perspective, maybe you can add some more. But what in terms of the content, you can say what's important. Again, tell the miracles. I don't know if Shinuim is as much in the content or much as different actions that we have. Like he explains, you're supposed to give out treats to the children, and you are supposed to.
Are you going to go through all these before we discuss?
What do you mean? Am I going to go through?
Like the actual question, or can we interject now?
You can ask, yes.
So what it seems to be is that the first half now.
Yeah.
Is basically describing the fact why we should be doing the second half.
Okay, you're saying why? Okay, good. So
so like here you're talking about like telling your children, like the 4 sons. You get and going through all the concept of that it's important even if you're a great sage and you still have to talk. So it seems that it's more like a preamble to saying, okay, if you don't know why, we have to discuss the second half, as you're calling it. This is the reason why.
Okay, maybe. Okay, I want to get back to part of that later.
Yeah. Okay.
But okay, so that's halacha gimel. Halacha dalid, he begins. This again, I think focusing more on the content. But tzarech lahaskel begnus ulusayim b'shevach. You have to begin the discussion with the denigration of the Jewish people, when they were at their lowest, ulusayim b'shevach, and finish off with their praise. So Kate said, what does that mean? Matchil mesaper. How do you begin? Shebetchila ayu avosenu b'meterach. That initially, again, in times, we come from terach. Umilfanav kofrim betoim achar hevel rotpin achar avodah. That we come from ancestors who were of the avodah zarah, who were idol worshippers. Umisayim b'das ha'emes. And then we should conclude b'das shekirvanu hamakom lo, that God brought us close to Him. V'hivdilanu min hatoim. They separated us out from the wanderers, I guess, from the other nations almost. V'kirvanu lichuda. He singled us out to take us. That's one element. V'chein matchil modia. So too, you should begin and explain she'avadim hayinu lefaro b'mitzrayim, that we were slaves to Paro in Egypt. V'chol hara shegmalanu, and all the bad that took place. And we conclude with all the miracles that happened that led to our freedom. How do you accomplish this? You do this by, again, extrapolating and expanding upon the psukim of Arami Beit Avi, which again the psukim of Devarim, ad sheigmor kol parsha, until you conclude that whole section. V'chol hamosif u'marich b'parsha zeh harei zeh meshubach, and everybody who adds on to this, it is the more the better. And then, okay, so that adds another element. There's an element here we have of beginning, talking about, you could say, the denigration, and finishing off with the praise, and also the idea, you could say, the main element, which is expanding upon the psukim of Arami Beit Avi. In the last two halachos here, the Rambam talks about some of the elements that come again towards the end of the of Maggid, that of the statement of Rabbi Gamliel says you have to say, Pesach Matzah Maro in order to fulfill your obligation, and that we have to. And Halacha Vav is, I think, somewhat of a well-known Rambam, that we say in every generation, Chayab Adam Laharos es atzmo, not to see yourself, but to show yourself. That's what people like to say. You have to act upon it. We have to act to make it look like we were physically leaving Egypt. You have to put yourself in that mindset, to act upon it. Don't just try to see yourself, but really try to show that you were there. Okay, that was a bit of a side point. But that's so. So again, what are we trying to do? So again, we're trying to tell the miracles. We're trying to, again, begin by the Knut, Mesayim V'Shevach, Arami Beit Avi. So when we look at the beginning of Maggid, now when I'm talking about the first half, again, I'm really talking about the beginning until the section of Arami Beit Avi. So what do we have? We begin with Halach Ma'anya. The section of, you can open your Haggadah to Maggid if you want to look inside. If you don't have one, I have extras. So the first section that a lot of people Sorry?
I have more Haggadah.
Oh, okay. So I think we're okay. So halach ma'anya is that you go ahead and you state this is the bread of our affliction. Then you almost say, you invite people in. The whole question, why are we saying that here? If you want to invite people, do it sincerely. Actually invite people before the meal, not in the middle of the meal. There seems to be a lot of questions, not even clear if this is part of Maggid or not part of Maggid. Then we have manishtana. So the 4 questions. So this, you can say, if I'm going to fit into the Rambam, maybe can relate to some of the shinuyim. Again, what is the whole idea of manishtana? What is different from tonight than all other nights? So certainly this is part of the idea of changing things up so that the children will ask.
How do they ask? We say, on all the nights we dip once, tonight we dip twice.
We haven't dipped yet. Okay, so we might just be showing, it could just be saying, look ahead, watch out for the following changes that are going to happen, and try to figure out, notice the differences almost that are going to take place. The next section, Avadim Hayinu leFaro Mitzrayim. Here's where we go ahead and we say that we were slaves to Paro in Egypt. God took us out. And then we conclude that section that even if we were all wise, if we were all smart, we all knew the whole Torah, we still have a mitzvah to tell, to go on and speak with the story of the Exodus. And whoever says more, the better. Okay, so the first part, obviously, the fact that we were slaves to Egypt seems to be relevant. That can definitely fit into the idea of matzil b'gnus, that we start off talking about how we were lowly, how, the denigration. But the whole second part, talking about that, if we were, even if we were all very wise, that we'd have to tell the story of Yetzias Mitzrayim, that we're not fulfilling any mitzvah there. It's about the mitzvah, we're not fulfilling anything with there. That's the start. Then we go on, we have the story of the 5 rabbis. Story of the 5 rabbis, they stay up all night talking about Pesach until their students come and say, time has come for Kriyat Shema. It's a nice story, and we definitely spend a lot of time talking about it. But why do we need this story? What are we accomplishing with this story? What is that doing for us? And then I'll go on to the next section. Next section is Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says, this is the story where he says, I feel like I'm 70 years old. And most people spend half the time talking about that part of it. Why does he say, I'm like 70 years old, he was 18, you grew a beard overnight, whatever you want to say happened. But what's this section here? So the section he's talking about is that, I finally realized that we have a mitzvah, you can almost say Kriyat Shema at night. Because why? Because every single night of the year, we have a commandment that we must remember Yetzias Mitzrayim. On Pesach night, we have a commandment to tell the story. Every other night of the year, we have a mitzvah to remember. So why is that here? That has nothing to do with anything about the story of Pesach. And then we go on to the 4 sons. So again, the 4 sons, again, it's a nice idea, wherever it comes from, the Midrash that it comes from, but where do these 4 sons come from? Why do we need them here in the beginning of the Haggadah? Then we continue. We say Yachol mi Rosh Chodesh. Is it possible that we could fulfill the mitzvah of Rosh Chodesh? And then we end up saying, no, you have to fulfill the mitzvah tonight. Okay. Then we have the next paragraph of Mitchila of the Avodah Zarah, that we began. Again, our ancestors were worshipped idols. So again, this can very well this can actually fit into the idea of matkil bignus, again, that we're starting off in the denigration, and then we really get towards vihishamda, and then the next section. So now that those are the different sections that we're talking about, so I just want to go through we're not going to go through each one, but take 1 or 2 approaches to ask questions and see why some of those elements might be incorporated into the Haggadah that we have nowadays. The first maybe approach I want to take is by Daniel Goldschmidt. He wrote this Haggadah. It's really more of an academic work. I think probably one of the best academic works that they have on the Haggadah, talking about the history of the Haggadah, how it all came into being. And so I want to share. Yeah. Thank you, Rabbi Berman, for giving me the book. So I just wanted to, based on him, look at a few elements. And a lot of what we'll talk about actually is, I mentioned a few times this idea of starting Matkil B'Gnos U'Mesayim B'Shevach, beginning in denigration and finishing off with the praise. So where does all this come from? So if you want to turn, so what's going on with that whole section? So if we turn the source sheet just to the next page. So I titled this section, how many Haggadahs do we have? How many different Haggadahs do we have? And we'll see what we mean. And I want to start off with the Mishnah in Pesachim. Again, the Mishnah here is taught in the 10th parak of Pesachim talks about the Seder. The first 9 prakim talk about the Korban Pesach, Chametz, the 10th parak which talks about the Seder. So I want to share source number 2, parak Yud, Mishnah Daled. So what happens? Mazgu lo kol sheni. We pour the second cup. Techana ben shoel aviv. So again here the son asks, V'im ein das beven aviv melamdo. And if the child doesn't know how to ask, the father will teach him. Man nishtana layla zeh mikol halelos. Why is this different? Goes on and asks, shebecholos anu ochlim chametzu matzah layla zeh kulo matzah. Question 1, Shebechol Eilos Anu Ochlim Sha'ar Yirakos Alay Zem Aror. 2, Shebechol Eilos Anu Ochlim Basar Tzli Shaluk Mubushal Hailal Lahazek Kulot Sali. We don't ask that anymore because we don't have the Korban Pesach. And the fourth question, Shebechol Eilos Anu Matlim Pamachas Alay Zeh Peamim. Okay, ask those questions. Ulfi Daito Shel Ben Aviv Melamdo. Again, however wise the child is, that the father has to teach him on his level. Again, Matchil Bignus. Again, begin with that. Mesayim B'Shevach. The Doresh Me'arami Aviravi Ad She'igmor Kol HaParsha Kula. Okay, so we spent a lot of time talking about the Gnus and the Shevach. So what is the Gnus? What is this denigration? And what is this praise that we are talking about? So in source number 3, this is a discussion that we have in the Gemara. Where anyone know what the two answers are? What's the Gnus? What is the denigration that we have? No, that's not Armi Oved.
I mean Terah.
Yeah, right. We talked about it because the Rambam already mentioned this, and we read this in the Rambam. So source number 3, that's what the Gemara says. Matchil b'gnus u'mashayim b'shebach. My gnus. What is this denigration that we are talking about? What do we have to start about that's so bad? So Rav says, Mitchila ovdei avodas gilulim hayu avasenu. You know what's so bad? The fact that our ancestors were idol worshippers. Shmuel says, no. What's so bad? Avadim hayinu leparo b'mitzrayim. Again, that we were slaves, and now we are going free. So what do we follow? How do we paskin? What's in our Haggadah? Both. Okay, good. So source number 4, Rabbeinu Chananel. So recently at the Chag HaSmicha that was out a few weeks ago, so the speaker who's for the graduating class based a lot of his speech on the fact that there was a contradiction between the English Wikipedia of YU and the Hebrew Wikipedia of YU. So Rabbeinu Chananel, so I noticed a similar idea. We were talking about it recently with my Chavrusa in the Kollel, and we were trying to determine, was he the end of the Gaonim or was he the beginning of the Rishonim? When exactly he lived, around the year 900, 1000. So different time. The Gaonim are, right, that's exactly the time period between. So I said he was the end of the Gaonim. My Chavrusa said he was the beginning of the Rishonim. And sure enough, we looked on Wikipedia on the Hebrew and the English. On the Hebrew, I think he was right. On the English, I was right. So he lived sometime. I think he lived sometime in the 10th century. So Matchil Begnus. So he says Maihi. So again, Amar Rava. So he quotes different opinions. Instead of Rav Shmuel, he has Rava Mitchila Ovdei Kochavim Hayu Avosenu. Rav Yosef Amar Avadin Haynu Lefaro. Behaidna. Nowadays, what do? Avdinan Kitarvayu. We paskin like both of them. We incorporate both of them into our Haggadah. But when we talk about this, and we do have both that we just read. We have the Mitchila of the Avodah Zarah, and we have the Avadim Hayinu before as well. But when we have this machlokas between Rav and Shmuel, so the Rishonim actually argue, what exactly are they arguing about? One school of thought believes that they're arguing about, they're not really arguing in terms of content. Rav agrees that Rav, again, who says what? Now I'm confused. Rav says we have to begin with our forefathers were slaves, were idol worshippers. So we're saying, so one approach is to say that no, he agrees that we need to incorporate the fact that we were slaves as well, and Shmuel thinks that we need to incorporate the fact that our ancestors were idol worshippers. All they're arguing about is what comes first. What should we say first in the Haggadah? If that's true, then I don't think Rabbeinu Chananel can take that approach, because then you can't really paskin like both of them. You can't say they both come first. One of them has to come first in the Haggadah. So he obviously is coming from the approach that there's actually a machlokas, that there's actually a real argument between Rav and Shmuel. What do we view as, as really the beginning, the denigration? What do we view? Well, they don't argue, actually. They don't argue about what the praise is at the end. They only argue about the beginning. But according to Rabbeinu Chananel, it seems to be that they actually have a machlokas, that Rav didn't incorporate Shmuel, Shmuel didn't incorporate Rav, and then Rabbeinu Chananel says, yeah, we're going to incorporate both of them. But 7 centuries earlier, that was not true. So I don't know if it's based on this, but now let's go back to what Daniel Goldschmidt writes in his Haggadah. And he suggests the following. He goes back and he says, why do we even need this argument of Rav and Shmuel in the first place? If you want to look back and fulfill this requirement of Matchil B'Gnos U'Misayim B'Shevach, beginning denigration, finishing off with praise, so just go to the Arami of BAYT. Go to those 4 psukim, because how does that whole section start? The section starts Arami of BAYT. Different ways to interpret that, but you can look in the Haggadah if you want. But certainly Arami of BAYT, some will explain that, an Armenian tried to kill my father, maybe Laban tried to kill Yaakov, and then it explains how we went to Egypt and we were slaves there. So that is certainly a denigration. Again, maybe the fact that Laban tried to kill Yaakov, or maybe the fact that we were slaves in Egypt, but that certainly incorporates that. And then the psukim go on, and they conclude the last of the psukim. They don't list them all 4 together here. I'm sorry I didn't bring them together. But the last of the psukim really explain how God took us out of Egypt and brought us and brought us to Eretz Yisrael. I think what's the last pasuk in that section? Right. Well, we have a pasuk by Yotzienu Hashem Mitzrayim, that God took us out of Egypt, Yad Chazaka Bizrot Nituya, with an outstretched arm and great terror, with Morah Gadol, Ubaosos Moftzim, with all these signs and all the wonders. So that certainly is some sort of praise, the fact that God took us out of Mitzrayim, fulfilling all these miracles. And I thought the parsha goes beyond that. But that certainly can be a Maktub B'Gnos Messiah B'Shevach. Why do we need Rav Shmuel talking about Avadim Hayinu? Why can't that all be fulfilled within Arami Oved Avi? Why do we need these other elements, for Rav and Shmuel to go ahead and argue? So what he suggests, actually, is that we're dealing with 3 separate Haggadahs. That, again, when the Torah talks about Haggadah, there's no formal text of the Haggadah. But it happens to be now, I think we all use the same text. We have a mitzvah to tell the story of Sipor Yitzias Mitzrayim. And I think what he explains, what it used to be is that everybody told the story however they saw fit to tell the story. They would use their psukim, they would use their methods in order to tell the story.
Are there different Haggadot across Taiwan, or is it pretty uniform?
I don't know. In terms of the current Haggadahs, I can't tell you. For one difference that I can think, but this is going back, and I don't know if anybody uses, the Rambam's Haggadah, for example. In the Rambam's Haggadah, which he prints at the end of at the end of the section of Mishnah Torah, so at the end of Arami BAYT, that's it. He doesn't have the section of Dayenu and all the miracles that happen at the sea. He doesn't have any of that. So so that's definitely different in that aspect. But I don't know if anybody uses the Rambam's Haggadah nowadays. So I don't know what the Teimanim. If they follow the Rambam, then they might have that difference. Beyond that, I don't know.
Right, but that's not so substantive.
No, that's not so crucial, because talking about those miracles, 40, 250, you're right, doesn't seem to be, might not be the most important thing. You want to cut it out.
I want to cut out the end.
The second night.
I
don't know. I wonder. I can look in here and see. He might. Definitely didn't read all of it, so he might have it.
I'm exhausted already.
Yeah, we're exhausted, exactly.
But what Daniel Goldschmidt again suggests is that we're actually dealing with 3 different Haggadahs. One Haggadah that we have is almost the Haggadah the Mishnah talks about. That's Arami BAYT. That's one way to tell the story. You go through those psukim, and that is definitely Maskil B'Gnos Messiah B'Shevach. But there were 2 other ways. Rav had his Haggadah. Shmuel had his Haggadah as well. So when we start Avadim, so what he explains is that when we start the Maggid section, Avadim Hayinu Lefaro b'Mitzrayim, he thinks that this is Shmuel's Haggadah. Shmuel, again, I don't think he's saying this is Shmuel's full Haggadah, but these elements, these psukim, Shmuel would focus on this pasuk and expand upon that to tell the story. That's what he used maybe as his starting point to go ahead and tell the story. When Rav told the story, so he wouldn't start with that. He brought the psukim from Yoshua, like Mitchila Ovdei Avodah Zarah Hayu Vosenu, and that was his section. So, and really what he explains is that when you have the Maggid, when you put Maggid together, you have almost 3 different Haggadahs, and we're putting them together. You have the Aramiyah Beit Avi, which you could say is the one from the Mishnah. But Rav and Shmuel had their own Haggadahs as well, and those are incorporated in the beginning those are sections, elements of the first half of Maggid. Those are really old Haggadahs that they used that were keeping on those psukim, but you could say they're not. Okay, that's one approach. I'd say maybe the more academic approach, but that's how he explained the Haggadah was really put together. I want to look now maybe at one other approach, and that is let's take a look again, run through these sections. And I know my parents might know this because we talk about this almost every year at our Seder. But what are we doing in this first half? Really what we're doing in this first half of Maggid is that we're running through, you could say almost the 5 W's. The who, what, where, when, and why, and maybe even the how of Maggid, or of Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim, by telling the story. And what do I mean? For example, who has to tell the story? Well, we're telling you who has to tell the story. We said, Afilu, even if you're a Chacham, even if you're Kulanu Nevonim, Kulanu Zekenim, even if we all know the whole Torah, we have a requirement to tell the story of Yetzias Mitzrayim, and everyone who tells it more is better. And then we go ahead, and what else do we say? Then we bring the story of the 5 rabbis, that, even though they're all rabbis, they were all, you could say, the most learned people of their time, they were still taking part of the story, and certainly everybody else has to take part in as well. You can say, but the when are you supposed to fulfill it? Well, that might be the section of Yachol Mi Rosh Chodesh. You might have thought you could fulfill the mitzvah of Rosh Chodesh. No, we're telling you that you can't do it then. You can't do it on the 15th. It has to be, not early in the day. It has to be right now when the time you're eating matzah or maror. You can say the why. Why are we telling it? Well, that's what we said. Avadim hayinu lefaro b'Mitzrayim. We were slaves. God took us out. That's why we're fulfilling. That's why we are required to tell the story of Mitzrayim. The what? What are we saying? So here, you can say that. Well, again, we're telling Avadim Hayinu is also somewhat of the what as well. We're saying that we are slaves. The what also can be the Mitchila Hayu Avosinu of the Avodah Zarah, that we came from idol worshippers, or even the story of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, where he talks about this idea of, it's almost a contrast, but he's talking about this idea of Zechiras Yetzias Mitzrayim, not this telling of the story, which we have a mitzvah to do on Pesach, but remembering Yetzias Mitzrayim that we have every other night. So he's almost saying, that's for every other night. Tonight, Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim is going to be different. If you want to look at the how do you tell the story? Well, maybe that's where the 4 sons come in. How do you tell it? You're going to tell it differently to every different person you have. If you have a Chacham, you're going to tell it one way. If you have a Tam, you're going to tell it another way. If you have a Rasha, you're going to tell it a third way. You'll tell it another way. And therefore, if you look at that whole section, what are we doing? We're trying to explain what's the best way to fulfill the mitzvah of Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim. What is the best way to tell the story of Yetzias Mitzrayim? So that's what we're going through. Before we're going to get to the actual story, before we're going to go to Aramiyah Beit Avi and explain that we went down, there were plagues, explain everything that went on over there, we're going to tell you how to perform the mitzvah, and that's what we're doing in these sections. Again, the who, what.
So the who, what, why, and where would be halacha 1 to relate the miracles and wonders.
Well, what do you mean? I mean, I'm talking. You're going back to the Rambam.
Yeah. You don't think the 2 are on all 4?
What do you mean?
They're not 2. Whose idea is who, what, where, and when, and why?
Oh, I'm not putting this necessarily in the Rambam now.
No,
I'm just saying.
So it stands alone. Whose idea is it?
I've heard it from different people. I don't know. I can't tell you who the source is.
You can take credit for it.
No, it's not my idea. That's certainly not. So if that's true,
it fits within halacha 1.
Okay, you could.
Yeah.
I mean, again, halacha 1 is talking about telling the actual miracles, telling the story of the 5 rabbis isn't relating a miracle.
Right. So then why should we listen to what, where, when, why?
Okay, good. That's my next question. I mean, if that's true, and that's great, so fine. Now, this might be telling us how to perform the mitzvah Sipur Yisrael and do it. But then, why are we necessarily doing that right now? Why couldn't we do that the week before Pesach? You're prepared for this Seder. It seems like that if you want to say this idea that this is all almost a preparation for the mitzvah of Maggid, so why do we have to incorporate it in the Seder night? A week before, Shabbos Agado, whatever you want to say it, learn the laws that deal with Pesach. The Gemara talks about the idea of 30 days before Pesach, you should be already studying the laws of Pesach. So do this as well. Included in the laws of Pesach are the laws of Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim. How do you fulfill the mitzvah of telling over the story on the Seder night? So why, if that, again, it could be very nice and it could be very true that the who, what, where, when, and why is here, but why do we need it here? Why can't we have it any earlier? So I want to, again, suggest an answer that I saw. I think it's based on something I read by Rav Soloveitchik in the English books that he has on called Festival of Freedom. A lot of different essays that he has relating to Pesach. And again, he also goes back to this machlokes, this argument that we have between Rav and Shmuel. Again, we said what was their argument? How do you begin with the denigration? Either that we were slaves, or that we were idol worshippers. So what makes more sense, Michael? What makes more sense?
That we were slaves, because it's a festival of freedom.
Right. I mean, that's what we're talking about. Pesach, we're remembering. It seems you think almost what we are remembering is the fact that we were slaves, and then we're going free. That's what we're commemorating. That's what happened on Pesach night. We left Egypt. Shmuel's approach. That seems to make a lot more sense. What is Rav almost coming to teach us by saying that we have to remember that we were idol worshippers, and then he doesn't tell us even what the shvach is. The Rambam said the shvach might have been that God then took us as His people. Why do we need that? What is so special? What is unique about that on the Pesach night? And so just to look at the end. Source number 6 on the source sheet on the 3rd page. So the Rav points out the psukim in Devarim Perek Vav. This begins with the pasuk that we have talking about the Ben HaChacham, the wise one. How do we answer him the story? And from pasuk Kaf it says Ki shacha b'ncha machar lemor, when your child asks you Ma ha'idos v'achukim v'amishpatim asher tziva Hashem Elokeinu eschem. So again, what are these testimonies, these statutes, these ordinances which God has commanded you? Ve'amarta lebincha, what are you going to tell your son? Avadim hayinu lefaro b'Mitzrayim. You're going to tell him the story that we were slaves in Egypt. Vayotzienu Hashem miMitzrayim biyad chazaka. And God took us out. Vayitein Hashem osos mofsim gidolim v'ra'im b'Mitzrayim. God showed all these signs and these wonders in Egypt. V'faro v'chol beiso le'inenu. To Pharaoh, and to everyone else who saw it. Then ve'osanu hotzi misham. Then He took us out. Leman havi osanu lasis lanu esa aretz asher nishba lavosenu. He took us out in order to give us the land of Israel. And then, what else do you tell them? Vaitzavenu Hashem, that God commanded us la'asos es kol hachukim ha'ele, to fulfill all of these different mitzvos. Liyiras Hashem Elokeinu, to fear God, l'tovlanu kol hayamin l'chayosenu kayom hazeh, to preserve us, to keep us alive until this very day. And what the Rav points out here is that there seems to be 2 elements that we have to tell our child. That when the children ask, what is this? First you tell them the story of that we were slaves, avadim ayinu lefaro, they took us out. But what did we go to in Pasuk Kaf Daled? He thinks then that talking about the actual mitzvos, talking about the actual commandments that we have on the Seder night, is all part of relating the story of the Exodus to our children. And he says, how does the Haggadah prove this? So again, let's look through these sections of the Haggadah. He says, first of all, again, how do we begin? The last section of Avadim Hayinu talks about the fact that even if we all know, we still have a mitzvah to tell the story. And what's the next story? The story of the 5 rabbis. A lot of people are troubled with the story of the 5 rabbis because there's no source for it. Most of the other sections in Maggid have earlier sources. They come from the Gemara, they come from the Tosefta, they'll come from books that were written in the 3rd, 4th century, whatever, 1st, 2nd, whatever centuries they were. But there's no source. The only source for this story of the 5 rabbis is the Haggadah. It doesn't come from anywhere else.
Did they all live at the same time?
I think people point out that they might not even point out. There are a lot of issues with this story. But but if you look in source number 5, I want to just go back to source number 5. I brought a quote from the Tosefta. Even though this story it doesn't come from any earlier, there's a Tosefta which actually brings a very similar story. And here, so I want to look at Tosefta. You can look Halacha Yud Aleph. The story is really Halacha Yud Beis. Halacha Yud Aleph is Chayav Adam La'asok B'Hilchos Pesach Kol Halayla. That a man is required, that one is obligated to discuss the laws of Pesach all night. Afilu Beino Levein Afilu Beino Levein Beno, even with him and his son. Afilu Beino Levein Atzmo, even if he's just by himself. Afilu Beino Levein Talmido. Okay. That not the mitzvah of Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim talks about the mitzvah of learning the laws of Pesach. And then Halacha Yud Beis, Maaseh B'Rabban Gamliel Uzkenim. So let's look at the similarities. There's a story of Rabban Gamliel and the elders. Shahayu Misubin Beveis Baitos Ben Zonim Belud. So they were in the house, Baitos in Lod. Vehayu Asukin Behilchos HaPesach Kol Halayla. And they were learning the laws of Pesach all night. Ad Kros HaGever. I think that means until the roosters crow. Then they got up and they went towards the Beis HaMedrash. Seems to be a very similar story.
Geographically accurate too.
What do you mean?
Because there's near the airport, near Lod, is a little area called Mesubim.
Well, that's why, because of
this.
Well, so Bnei Brak's also in the same.
No, but it's not. But that's what they said that it was.
So you think they're going like this story?
Yeah.
It could be.
Well, every time I drive by, Benny tells me, so I have to relate it.
So the Rav, so he actually thinks that, I don't know if he thinks that they're the same story, or he thinks that really, he wants to go say, well, what was the whole story of Rabban Gamliel? They weren't talking about Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim all night. They were talking about the laws of Pesach all night. And that is what he thinks. What do you think the 5 rabbis here were talking about? He says, he doesn't think they were talking about, again, it's not not the best proof necessarily, but he says he doesn't think they're talking about the story of Yetzias Mitzrayim. He thinks they're talking about the laws of Yetzias Mitzrayim. And then furthermore, what's the next section? The next section is Amar Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. So our Haggadah say Amar. If you look in the Haggadah, the Rambam, it actually says Amar Lahem Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. That he told them. Who's them? Them is Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, was one of the rabbis in the previous story. So he thinks, the Rambam says that this whole story, this whole idea of, saying Kriyat Shema at night, this idea of remembering the Exodus every night, was discussed at their Seder. That's what they were talking about. Again, they weren't necessarily talking about the story and the miracle. They were talking about the commandment. How do you fulfill the story of Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim? How do you fulfill that mitzvah? Yeah.
But you don't have to say Kriyat Shema Levita, do you? Is that?
It's not at Alamita. It's time, but at Mariv.
I mean, they haven't done Mariv yet. You're saying
it's a machlokas whether that means that they didn't say Shema beforehand during Mariv, or if that meant that they did. They just didn't think they were fulfilling a mitzvah. Furthermore, if you look at all the questions of the 4 sons, we said Chacham Mahu Omer. You ask the question, what's the answer we give him? You tell him the laws of Pesach. Ein maftir achar Pesach afikoma. There's this theme of discussing laws on the Seder night. Not only is there a theme of telling the story, you guess Jews were slaves and all that, but there's an idea of talking about the actual commandments on the Seder night. And that would explain, for example, why are we talking about the who, what, where, when, and why of Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim? Because the Rav is saying, because those are all part of Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim. Telling the story, telling the laws are all part of it. So why is that so? Why are they all part of this? Why is that part of the mitzvah of Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim? And I don't know if this might be a bit me trying to put it into what he said. I don't know if he actually said this explicitly, but I think the reason could be because, again, what are we talking about? If we're trying, the whole idea of Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim is talking about our freedom, how we went free. So maybe that freedom can really only be marked by receiving commandments from God. You know, almost that before that point, before we received any commandments, before we received the Korban Pesach, so we were people, maybe we weren't really God's people yet. You could say we weren't really free, as much as we were, you can say that, again, we were slaves to Egypt. Maybe that was, and he was, maybe we were even about to leave Egypt. But you could say almost until we received that first law, that's really what made us free. That's what builds the connection, you could say, between us and God. And if that's the whole idea of marking our freedom, is to, the idea of freedom isn't only to leave the slavery in Egypt, but also to go ahead and build upon, become God's people, to be chosen as God's people, and build that relationship with Him. So that might be why we're going to spend a significant part of the Seder and Maggid talking about the laws of Pesach, because by talking about the laws, that in essence is also another way to talk about our freedom. We talk about our freedom by talking about the stories and the miracles, everything God did to us, but also by talking about the laws. And the laws that we choose to talk about are the laws of this telling the story, which we're about to perform. And that, in essence, is you can say part. That's why it's the first part and the second part of Maggid are really all part of one greater theme of describing the Jewish people's freedom from Egypt. The first part coming through talking about the laws, the second part coming about describing the story of the Exodus. So that's really, again, just to sum up, talk about different approaches. What you could say more that we have different Haggadahs. The whole part of the first half is different Haggadahs that we're putting together, and that all together ends up as one larger Haggadah that we have nowadays. Or maybe this idea of the first half of the Haggadah talking about describing really the mitzvah of Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim, and using that way of talking about the mitzvah as another way to really push the idea of the Jewish people's freedom that they experienced from Egypt, and also the freedom maybe spiritually in terms of building that closer connection that we have with God. Any questions?